Hi everyone, my name is James Petty. I'm from the Victorian Alcohol and Drug Association. Welcome to this webinar on AOD and young people and AOD. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today and acknowledge that sovereignty of this land was never ceded. So for me, that's Brunswick, the land of the Wurundjeri Willen people. But we're obviously meeting from diverse lands today, so I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging of those varied lands and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. I'd also like to acknowledge the importance of this issue to Australians First Nation people. Like so many issues, Indigenous Australians are overrepresented in the harms relating to alcohol and drug use, especially amongst young Indigenous Australians. And the inadequacy of our responses to youth AOD continue to disproportionately impact Indigenous Australians. So this webinar is presented as part of the TriPeaks program. So TriPeaks is a collaboration between the Victorian Alcohol and Drug Association, VADA, the Victorian Healthcare Association, and the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare. So TriPeaks is aimed at improving collaboration between those sectors that each of those peaks represent. TriPeaks is an initiative of the Victorian Government. So just a couple of housekeeping issues. Just to let everyone know that this webinar will be recorded and the slides will be made available afterwards. So I'll send a link to everyone who's registered for the webinar, a link to the recording. And if you do want a copy of the slide deck, please send me an email, and my email's on the invite that you would have received to this webinar. If you have any questions for Geoff, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So that's different from the chat function. You are welcome to use the chat if you want to say anything there, but it won't be closely monitored. So if you do have a question, please send it into the Q&A function. And you can also use that to upvote other people's questions. So if you've got the same question that someone else has asked, you can kind of click on that and bring it to the top of the list. So thanks for everyone for being here. I'm very pleased to introduce Geoff Bayldon. It would be difficult to find someone more qualified than Geoff to be talking today. Currently, Geoff is the Youth AOD Principal Practitioner in the Eastern Metro region for DHHS. Geoff worked at the Youth Support and Advocacy Service, has worked at the Youth Support and Advocacy Service for 18 years across many of their programs, including outreach, their day program, a drug withdrawal unit, long-term residential rehabilitation, and was also the YSAS Community Programs Manager. More recently, he was the senior trainer and practice consultant at YSAS. Geoff has a passion for therapeutic adventure-based programs. So these focus on creating development opportunities for young people through positive risk-taking and challenges. He has developed a multi-service program for Aboriginal young people, which involved taking the group on a snowboarding camp. And he's also developed a young parents retreat for young people with substance issues and their children. So, and that was focused on promoting positive family relationships for young people with substance use issues and children. Geoff has extensive training experience teaching courses on youth AOD to a range of organisations, including Victoria Police, as well as mainstream and specialist schools. Currently, he's providing training focused on methamphetamines to Victorian Human Services organisations as part of the Beginning Practice program through Child Protection. So I'm going to stop there because otherwise we'll never start, but the list goes on of Geoff's qualifications and experience. So thanks everyone for being here, and I'll pass over to Geoff.
Thanks very much, James. So I just wanted to echo your sentiments and your acknowledgement of the traditional custodians, but also wanted to acknowledge that we're in an incredibly trying and odd time at the moment with the global pandemic, and that just this medium of Zoom may be becoming aversive to some people, and it's a bit of a new thing for a lot of us. So it's hard to be connected, embodied and safe in two dimensions. So hopefully we all feel like we can ask questions and share towards the end, and please, if anything comes up, do add that. So I'm going to, in a moment, share my little screen, go through a PowerPoint that we're going to talk about today. But I guess one thing I wanted to quickly acknowledge, this is absolutely sort of a very cursory, intro-y overview of some of these topics, and I would love to have a deeper conversation if anyone would like to. I'll include my email address at the end if anyone wants to have a chat or continue or discuss any of this material or get any resources. So allow me to try and find my little thing, share it. There we go. Awesome. Oh, sorry. Next. So, about young people and substance use today. So we're going to have a quick look at adolescent development with some of the interesting people in the field and some of the things that I guess for us in the youth AOD space, youth AOD practice has quite a variance from adult AOD practice because we take into account some of the drivers of substance use behaviours for young people are going to be very much related to adolescent development, and they're going to be very much related to identity formation, risk-taking, peer connections and various other things. So when we're trying to understand the behaviour of substance use for young people and what its purpose, meaning and function is, understanding the developmental context in which they're sort of nested is really important for us to get some clues about what needs it's meeting for them and how else we can go about finding appropriate meaningful resources to meet those needs in an ideally safe and more sustainable way. We'll have a really brief overview of resilience-based practice, which is our sort of, not ours, but many people's approach to working with young people, and I guess how our approach, our version of resilience-based practice might vary a little bit, taking into account some other factors. And I guess it also gives us a framework for looking at how we can all, in all of our different sectors, in the spirit of the Tri-Peaks endeavour, how we can all work together to reduce the harms and risks around AOD use and provide better opportunities for young people. So it's a collaborative endeavour. Hopefully we can have a bit of a discussion about some practice approaches, so getting into the detail of the work with young people, what works, what doesn't, some sort of tips and tricks and things that we've come across as being effective, and then hopefully have a bit of discussion, answer some questions and have a chat. So we'll kick things off, and apologies if this is a bit how to suck eggsy for anyone, but I think we want to make sure we're covering all of the bases for people who might not have seen this in a while. So thinking about adolescent development, there's a lot of different contributions to our understanding of this, and just to acknowledge some of the historical building block theories around adolescent development, and quickly just jump on a couple of ideas here which are very relevant to our work in the youth AOD space. So you're probably familiar with all of these wonderful folks who've contributed to our understanding of young people and development. But one, and all of these theories have critiques, absolutely. They're not magical and all-encompassing, but I guess I wanted to just flag up the ideas of Erik Erikson around identity formation and the sort of that process in adolescence of figuring out who you are in relation to your family, your peers, sexual identity, that process of identity formation. Because I want to come back to that when we're thinking about some of the drivers for adolescent substance use, some of the things people might be getting out of it. And also thinking about some of Piaget's work around cognitive development and potentially the impact that trauma might have on pushing some of those cognitive developmental processes, maybe pushing them back a little bit. So we might have some young people in that earlier period of adolescence who we probably need to acknowledge need a bit of a modified approach. So moving on to ecological and experiential theories, and these broadly sort of look at the way that young people or adolescents development is impacted by not just the young person and their internal processes, but very much by the environment and the ecosystem and the connections that they belong to and exist in. So, most of you people, I'm sure, are familiar with ecological systems theory, and I think this sort of thinking about this the other day in terms of what kind of an impact does a global pandemic have on the development of young people, their sense of safety, their sense of hope and optimism, and obviously that the interconnectivity between that that global pandemic and work and employment systems, education systems, government systems, and what that ultimately means for young people growing up in this time. Obviously, attachment theory is very important in our working with young people, and I think that this is something that I guess we've had some challenges over the years where young people's attachment styles have maybe been misconstrued or unfortunately painted as being treatment aversive, or treatment resistant, which is a term that I find really problematic. So, obviously young people who've had early life traumatic experiences, lots of issues around those attachment relationships early on, might feel profoundly unsafe making new connections, and for a lot of reasons, not necessarily work in their best interest in terms of engaging with supports, working on drug and alcohol issues, developing capacities and skills. So I think keeping that in mind when working with adolescents is really key. And social learning theory, I think I'll talk about in a second, is one of my favourite people in the whole world, VYGOTSKY. And VYGOTSKY talked a lot about this idea of the zone of proximal development, which again I think is really fundamental to working with young people, working with adolescents broadly, and especially in terms of building capacity and resilience, and finding other alternatives to substance use to meeting those needs. So essentially what he's talking about here is the idea that that young people, or all people, have a proximal learning zone. So there's things that are in our comfort zone, I'm sure everyone's heard of that term, that we can do all day, every day, absolutely standing on our head, no dramas. And there's things in that sort of overwhelm zone or overreach zone that we can't do at all, like advanced quantum physics. I'm not going to be able to do that even if someone gave me all the textbooks. Still couldn't do it, way outside my scope. But drinking 18 coffees a day, 100% could do that standing on my head. So thinking about what things, how we pitch and titrate our sort of our work with young people to be constantly in that challenge zone. So we and recalibrating over that adolescent period, that we don't want to be sort of stuck in that comfort zone, that we want to be always trying to find ways of challenging and building capacity. But this kind of gets to some fundamentals of the approach to working with young people with AOD issues, that we need to understand them in a really holistic, multidimensional way, and in a way that is near impossible to capture in a referral or a single assessment process. That we need to understand their shape. So if we're going to try and provide experiences, try and provide alternative resources, try and provide capacities for them to meet their needs without having to rely on substance use or an array of other less helpful behaviours, then we're going to need to know what those new experiences and skills and resources are, and pitch them in such a way that they're in that challenge zone and not in that overwhelm zone. So that's really reliant on deeply understanding that young person and seeing them in their context. Vygotsky also talked about scaffolding and that idea that not doing for, but creating an environment where young people are empowered to have the support to do things for themselves, and that's needs to be adjusted and addressed over time to make sure we stay in that sweet spot. So thinking of all of these little theories and contributions, how do we broadly understand adolescence? So Sarah Jane Blackmore, who's an academic in the field of adolescent development, talks about adolescence starting with biology and ending when, as in pubertal maturation, and ending at a time when young people achieve a stable, independent role in society. Lawrence Steinberg says that it begins with biology and ends with culture. And by that, he's talking about the hormonal changes that can begin as early as 10, sometimes earlier, that trigger changes in the brain that aren't, those changes aren't driven by hormones, but hormones are the catalyst for a change in brain functioning that sets up adolescents to be in this amazing space of profound plasticity, making amazing new neuronal connections, learning things, growing and developing in a profoundly effective and useful way. And that period of plasticity and that period of sort of adolescent brain change tends to finish or end or come to a conclusion when things kind of settle down, when you get a bit of stability, when things get sort of normal and samey. And Lawrence Steinberg talks about the idea of that plasticity begets plasticity. So if you're still doing novel, exciting, interesting, weird things, the longer you continue that, the longer your brain will stay plastic and go, okay, cool. So we're still learning and growing and developing. And can go up to mid-20s, potentially later. So this process, obviously there's physical, emotional, social changes, psychological changes that go along with this. But this is a beautiful, wonderful, and amazing episode in our development that allows us to adapt to our environment in really amazing ways. So depending on what's around us and who's around us and how things are going, we can learn and grow and adapt and develop to fit that environment particularly well. And then once we've learned and developed and grown all those skills, then our brain swaps plasticity for efficiency, and we get the pruning and myelination and the sort of speed and efficiency of adulthood that sets us up to be able to thrive in that environment. And really importantly here is the idea of what is available in that environment to learn from and adapt to, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail. But this is really important. If you think about some of the environments that we find the young people we support in, not just relational environments, physical environments, but cultural environments, and I'm talking probably more about peer culture, offending culture. If anyone out there works with young people who identify as lads or eshays, wearing Nike dry fits, Everlast bum bags, TNs, and talking about how sick cursor is, there's some cultural drivers of how that process of adolescent development is going to work. And getting back to our little our friend Eric Erickson around identity formation, if you think about the experiences that you have through adolescence to at the far end of adolescence potentially come out with a stable, consistent, coherent sense of your identity and where you fit in the world, that's very much contingent on the experiences you have through that period and what the environment allows. So if you spend your entire adolescence in Parkville Youth Justice Centre, then that's going to have a profound impact on the sort of identity that you come out with, the way you understand yourself at the far end of that, amongst many other things. So just a quick fanboy shout out to some people who I find really interesting in the field in the last sort of 10, 20 years and who influence sort of our work here at YSAS, and particularly like the work I do at the moment is focused on young people in out-of-home care and young people in youth justice, that sort of crossover kids cohort. So these folks have a really interesting take on, a lot of really useful stuff to input into that. So Lawrence Steinberg, as I mentioned, professor at Temple Uni in the States, he does a lot of stuff around adolescent culpability. And some of you may hopefully be shocked to know that until not that many years ago in America, it was possible for young people as young as 10 to be tried as adults and potentially be put to death, which is kind of insane when we think about the way the adolescent brain works and and some of the implications for behaviour around that. So he talks a lot about neuroplasticity, loves it, and I think in that terms of that particularly profound period of plasticity, if we think back to trying to learn skills, develop things when you're 15, 16. I remember trying to learn guitar when I was 15, 16, and 10 minutes later, basically a virtuoso. Try doing something like that in your mid-30s, and 6 weeks later, you can barely play Smoke on the Water. So those sort of experiences, people are really well set up to learn, grow, and develop. Lawrence Steinberg talks a bit about the imbalance between sort of the reason for the risk-taking or the riskiness is around that imbalance between the emotional drivers and the executive functioning, so limbic and cortical areas, and not just the imbalance of activity, but also the lack of connectivity between those two regions. And one of the things that he proposes to be useful in supporting greater connectivity is greater scaffolded experience, so facilitated, supported experience of risk-taking and more experiential approaches where an attuned adult caregiver, worker, whoever it might be, can help make those, lend a lovely, wonderful cortex to the young person and help sort of describe and understand those drivers and the actions, the consequences, and create a greater communication between those brain regions. Dan Romer, who I'm a huge fan of, he talks about, he's a bit of a counters Lawrence Steinberg a little bit in terms of risk-taking in adolescence. Again, he's not so much of it's a prefrontal cortex deficit thing, like you just need to learn more executive functioning, emotional regulation, impulse control. He's a bit more about the idea that there are essentially two types of risk takers, that there's young people who are sensation seekers, who might be sort of less dopamine sensitive, so are more keen to find thrilling, exciting, novel activities to increase dopamine secretion, and those young people are going to be more exploratory. Those young people have a much greater connection between the prefrontal cortex and those limbic areas. So they take a risk, do an activity, do a silly thing, whatever it might be, and they're more likely to learn from it and develop a database to draw from into adulthood. And he talks about verbatim versus gist-based decision-making, which I find very interesting, but I don't have time to go into in great detail. But essentially the idea is that over time, you don't actually think about the risks you're taking. You just kind of go with your gut and how that gut sense gets developed. And the other type of more risky risk takers, more problematic risk takers, are those who impulsive risk takers, or acting without acting without thinking. And he talks a bit about the idea that those people have a lifelong potential deficit, or it's a terrible word, but limitation around their impulse control, and that could possibly be consequent of early life traumas, so ACEs. There's a whole bunch of evidence about that having an impact on people's capacity to develop that, and also experientially and from a learning perspective, attuned caregivers helping model and show that stuff. So the thing that's really useful to think about here is that in terms of supporting those two people, because we can't stop risk, we work with risk, and some of those risks are substance use, and some of those risks are offending and various other things, that rather than getting people to sit still and pay attention and turn 25, we need to work with that risk and provide experiences for learning and development. But for the second group I mentioned, we need to do much more work on improving impulse control and working on some of those areas, rather than just providing experiences for learning. So interesting, folks. I'm going to play a really quick video here because this is the sainted Dan Siegel. This is just I'm a dad of a 2-year-old at the moment, and I'm really getting into dad jokes and puns, leaning in, as they say. And the other thing I like about this is in my work with parents, carers, people who are trying to understand how this beautiful, magical 8-year-old who was drawing you pictures and bringing you muffins suddenly turned into a member of YSAS, and what happened there, that this gives a really nice, safe, non-blaming, non-judgy way for parents to understand the change and understand that there is benefit to the change, and working with it's great. So hopefully, if the sound doesn't work, someone please yell out.
So the brain changes by nature's design to get you ready to have 4 fundamental elements that I'm going to name now. And luckily, if you reorder them and rearrange them and spell them in certain ways, the essence of adolescence is an acronym that actually spells out these 4 elements. Let's do it. ESSENCE. That's the word essence. The first one is ES, emotional spark. And to describe this to you, I'm going to briefly enable you to picture this, because the Tarcher Penguin people have been really, really kind. They have taped a model of the brain under your chair that you can take home with you. And if you reach under your chair, put your hand under your chair, see where they've taped it with that blue tape that comes up. And if you pull out your arm, you will find attached to your arm a hand. And has anyone found a hand attached to your arm? There it is. So that you can take home with you. And this is your handout for today's talk. And this is your handy model of the brain. If you put your thumb over the top and put your fingers over your thumb, put your thumb in your palm and put your fingers over your thumb, this is the model of the brain. And basically what I want to point out to you is that you have a higher part of the brain called the cortex. If you lift up your fingers, the lower part of the brain, the limbic area, this thumb area, and the brainstem are basically the source of our emotions, or rise up from the body to the brainstem and the limbic area, these lower areas. So we'll just call these the lower areas. It turns out that what nature does is make it so that the input from the lower areas to the higher thinking, reasoning part of the cortex, this higher part of your hand model, is much higher. So we're going to name that an emotional spark. And what it means is that there's pros and cons to these changes. The pros are that adolescents have a more intense emotional influence on their thinking than earlier in their lives and often than later in their lives. This emotional spark, of course, gives life passion and energy and vitality. But what's the downside of this emotional spark is it makes life less predictable because you can become more moody, you don't know how you're going to feel in a given moment. So there is more shift in emotional states because of this emotional spark. Now, the emotion, the word emotion is really interesting because the way to think about it is emotion really means evoking motion. So emotion gets you to act. And part of the drive of this emotional spark is to get you to move your body and to get ready to leave home. There's a drive to life that happens during adolescence that's very important to note. The second thing, the SE of this emotional spark and now social engagement is what the next term is. It turns out that the brain is actually programmed when adolescence hits to push away from parents and move toward peers. So social engagement with peers is a natural part of adolescence. And a lot of parents will say to me they know the day that it began. For example, they'll say, well, I was walking my young child to school, my 12-year-old, and I went to the bus, and usually they give me a big hug and a kiss, and on that day onward, they would just push away from me, as if I didn't exist. Did any of you experience that? And a lot of the adults are going, yeah. And this is the natural way the adolescent brain is creating this readiness to push away. Now, why would adolescents need their peers more than their parents? Because you have to get ready to leave home, number one. And why do you need to be hanging out with your peers? There's safety in numbers, exactly. All mammalian species, the adolescents are social creatures, and they hang around with other adolescents because you are safer in groups. Now, membership in a group, then, is basically equivalent to surviving and not dying. So when an adolescent comes to you and says, I need to buy this jacket, not this one, but I need to buy a jacket, certain jacket, or wear certain shoes or whatever, the feeling of life and death about it is about this genetic history that if you are a member of a peer group, you will survive, and otherwise you will die. So it doesn't mean you have to buy the jacket or the shoes, but as a parent it means you can tune into what that feeling is. So that's the social engagement. And the novelty is one of the most powerful issues, novelty seeking. The brain creates a drive toward novelty in a very clever way. Have any of you heard of this neurotransmitter, this chemical called dopamine? Dopamine. Well, dopamine is a really interesting chemical, does a lot of different things, but one of the major things that it's involved in is something called the reward circuits. And one of the most rewarding kinds of activities that releases dopamine are novel activities. And so what happens in the adolescent brain is the baseline levels of dopamine drop, but the release levels are hugely increased. And what this means is that adolescents, when they're not doing anything, can be really, really bored. So they want to be engaged in something to get their dopamine secreted, but it means that they will be driven to try new things. Now, one of the kinds of new things that really secretes dopamine is something that involves risk and danger and pushing the boundaries. Now, the upside of that is it gets you ready to leave home and try something dangerous. But what's the downside? You can do something dangerous and actually get hurt. So you can imagine this struggle in the brain about how to get this kid out of the house, right? Because you've got to take risks to get out of the house. This is what you got to realize as a parent, is that if your child is completely risk averse, they're actually going to be having a hard time leaving home. So it's actually a significant issue if you're totally avoiding any kind of trying out of novelty, which this dopamine change involves. The final part of Essence is creative exploration. It turns out that when you look at the structure of the brain and how it's changing, the brain is also designed to push away from the world that the adults have created for them. And you know, I used to run a program with some colleagues at UCLA called the Center for Culture, Brain, and Development. So we would study how culture shapes the brain across different societies. And what we were able to show was that, in fact, the way you are taught things, not only by your family in attachment relationships, but by the larger culture, shapes the structure of the brain.
Cool. So hopefully people enjoyed that, and obviously the puns in there I think are delightful. But I guess what Dan Siegel was talking about in that video, I think is really useful for, you know, if you're working with parents and family who are trying to get their head around what's going on with their adolescent, but also some of those tasks of adolescence that are sort of immutable. That it's our job to support young people to have better resources to take those risks and to understand that those drives have a function. They allow, it's not normative, but it's developmentally the standard thing for those practices to happen. So rather than trying to shut them down, working with them is fundamental. And I think getting back to Lawrence Steinberg and Dan Romer about the neuroplasticity stuff, when we're thinking about young people's drug and alcohol use, that the focus is very much more in the youth AOD space on how we provide other resources and opportunities and assets and skills for young people to be able to pursue those things mentioned by Dan Siegel and some more I'll mention in a moment, without having to rely on substance use. And there's obviously a role to be played for sort of clinical drug and alcohol practice, but because of the plasticity of the adolescent brain, the way that it's sort of set up to learn and change and develop and grow, moving away from a pattern of drug use, moving to another potentially more adaptive or healthy, sustainable way of meeting those needs is much easier than later on in life. So those circuits are like, as I mentioned, are less hardwired and myelinated. They're still very much up for grabs. So our work is much more about recalibrating, providing better resources than it is about necessarily trying to sort of shut down an aberrant behaviour or a problem behaviour. So it's about finding what else is going to meet those needs. So to that end, that more ecological approach, these are a couple of luminaries in the field of resilience. You may have heard of Anne Marston and Michael Unger. And Anne Marston talks a lot about what's involved in resilience, and not only the idea that to be resilient, you need not just internal assets and resources like intelligence, problem-solving skills, helpful worldview, self-belief, impulse control, emotional regulation, all of those things. But you also need ecological factors, so meaningful connections to school, education, workforce, and healthcare. And by that I mean if you have to wait 45 minutes for a doctor's appointment and you're a young person who 45 minutes feels like a decade, and you get fed up of it and you leave, then that healthcare resource isn't really useful to you. So we're talking about resources and assets ecologically and connections that are meaningful and appropriate and tailored for the needs of not just all young people, but specific young people, given trauma histories, given attachment styles, given their schemas, worldviews, and potentially sometimes unhelpful beliefs or thoughts about help seeking. So those, connection to culture, opportunities for pro-social engagement with peers, all of those things build resilience. And Michael Unger, like I said, I'm quite interested in adolescent risk-taking. As I mentioned, I've got a background in adventure-based therapy, and obviously like experiential modalities. So one of the things Michael Unger talks about in his resilience work is the idea of risk-taking and responsibility-seeking, which I think sometimes gets overlooked. So young people and he talks about the idea of young people trying to find powerful identities. So is that, if that's well resourced, that might be a young person who's a school captain, who's the coaching the under 12s, netball team, might be a young person who is at YACVIC providing consultation and advice to a peak body. In a poorly resourced context, that might be a young person who can hook up his mates with meth or weed, and their phone's blowing up all the time, and all their mates are like, oh, you're a mad dog, like, you know everything that's going on, you're like, you're Johnny on the spot, you're the guy who gets it. And I think that idea of the powerful identity and sort of responsibility, wanting to be an important person, that's, when we're thinking about young people's drug use specifically, some of the drives and needs that are met through drug use are psychological needs. So for some young people, I've got a lot of stuff around methamphetamine. For some young people, they take methamphetamine because it makes them feel powerful, confident, in control, in charge, and switched on. And if you're a young person in a context like out-of-home care, resi care, where that's, the system's not set up to particularly empower those things, you get bounced from unit to unit, you have 14 case managers in a year, and you don't know, whether you're coming or going, or whether you're going living with mum and dad, or whether you're going back to auntie or uncle, what's happening. Feel completely overwhelmed and probably quite scared. Feeling confident, powerful, in control and in charge is going to meet a pretty profound need for you in a way that for all of us lovely, wonderful, hopefully well-connected and adjusted folks out there in Zoom land, that whilst meth might be enjoyable and fun, it wouldn't be meeting those profound needs. But I think when we're thinking about things like the developmental needs of wanting to have a powerful identity, or wanting to be seen as as an important person or at the top of the social tree, thinking about what that means for young people using methamphetamine, who go from using a couple of points here and there to maybe getting a gram on tick from a friend and from a dealer and selling a few points to some mates, and they get this feedback of oh, Geoff, you're a mad dog, it's sick, can you hook us up a couple of points? And Steve, I want to get a couple as well. And I'm going by myself an 8-ball, 3.5 grams, and now my dealer's like, you're a bit of an asset to me. You're an important person. I'm going to be pumping your tires and telling you you're a mad dog. All my friends are telling me I'm a mad dog. My phone's blowing up, and that's the profound need that's met. Like, I am an important and well acknowledged person amongst my peer group. But I have a strong sense of of importance and peer esteem that's afforded me, and that's for a lot of young people we've worked with, the actual draw and the feeling of methamphetamine, that sort of the euphoria and energy and power, confidence, control, the psychological impacts or features of meth use, that is way less important to them, and over time that's they have very little interest in the actual effects of the drug. The thing that's meeting the need in the most profound way is that, I'm a dealer, I've got money, I've got power, I've got respect, I've got all those sort of things which are particularly important to everyone, but they're particularly acutely important in adolescence. Michael Unger also talks about, in resilience, it's not just about having all of those resources and assets, both internally and externally. It's not just about having supportive connections and good quality relationships and great peers and a school that lets you have a modified timetable for whatever works to your needs and all that stuff. It's not just about having that. It's about having experiences of duress and stress and adversity where you need to take all of those internal and external resources and assets and operationalize them, put them into place, put them into practice. And that the analogy that sometimes uses, that you can have all of the tools in your shed, all up on a nice little shadow board, all sitting there nice and neat, power drills and saws and nails and hammers and all that stuff. But when your roof's leaking, you don't know how to use them until you grab them out, you start drilling holes and sticking stuff down and learn how to actually use those tools in context. And that process is a process that really needs to be scaffolded and supported. So quite often, back to our little VYGOTSKY zone of optimal development thing, the adversity, risk and challenge that the young people we work with are exposed to profoundly overwhelms their capacity to be resilient, to operationalise those skills and to bring them into practice. So making sure that those experiences aren't overwhelming and that where they are, they have, sometimes we might just step in, they have better resources, more heavy duty resources, but making sure that those experiences, people have a chance at adversity at the right level and challenge at the right level to allow them to get good at using those tools and to be comfortable with using those tools. And I think the stuff about resilience as well, which I'll get into and I'll cover again briefly, is the idea of this sort of endeavour of building resilience means that young people have more resources and assets and skills available to them and be able to use them and won't necessarily need to rely on things like substance use, self-injury, offending and various other more problematic behaviours to meet those needs. They're going to have something else in that place. And what it also means is that it takes this out of being a siloed magical skill set that only youth AOD workers can, with our magic pixie dust, can work with that cohort, that all of the community, all of the community services system, all of the care team, all of us are working together to create the conditions and resources to enable young people to be more resilient and more able to meet their needs in a pro-social, safe, healthy, sustainable way. So this is just again to some of those things that adolescents need to do that we can't stop, that we need to work with and resource and support. This list of things, I won't read all of them out, they're pretty sort of obvious ones I'm sure you're all aware of. And all of these things again are really malleable, and there's a whole other conversation I'd love to have about values, mobilising values and MI and all that stuff. But if you think about adolescence being a period of formulation and sort of development of values and morals and ethics and a code, if you will, that process is one, again, dictated by the environment, dictated by experience through that adolescent period. So they're not set in stone. They're absolutely up for grabs and malleable. And if we can create conditions to emphasise and empower those more positive values, mobilise those, and potentially shift the spotlight away from some of the more problematic sort of values and ethics, then we set young people up to be in a much more useful place into adulthood. And we also, in understanding, mobilising and working with values, tap into a really great resource for motivation. So, I'm sure everyone here has done goal setting before, SMART goals, wonderful as they are. SMART goals are, I guess, reasonably inert without an alignment to a value or a deeply held sort of important belief or sort of, value. That if people are working in alignment with a value or toward, in that sort of that what they're doing, the change potentially that we're trying to support them, moving away from cannabis use, moving into a more adaptive way of managing their stress and anxiety, it's going to be hard, it's going to be difficult, it's going to be arduous. So why would you do something hard, difficult and arduous? Because potentially that change is more closely aligned to your values and things that you hold dear. So by way of example, thinking about a young person I worked with a while ago who was using cannabis pretty heavily to manage anxiety, stress and overwhelm. And they had no interest in change. It was working for them. They get through 3-4 grams a day, totally fine. And also it had fitted into peer identity stuff. It was lauded and applauded and celebrated by their peers. So perfectly awesome. This young person had 2 younger siblings in foster care. They were in out-of-home care themselves. And one of the things we talked to that young person about is that the change would definitely benefit them, 100% useful for them. But a really important value of them was wanting to be a really awesome big brother, wanting to be the kind of person that supported and cared for and had their siblings back. And what we talked about is that for this young person, engaging with us around this skill building stuff, around other ways to manage stress and anxiety and and all of that work, that this would definitely benefit you. And if you got really good at it, your siblings would be able to see that this is actually effective stuff. It works, it's useful, and you might be able to support them with it, because they're, at 8, 9, 10, they're about to, heading headlong into adolescence. They're about to be in a place where they're going to be much more challenged and much more potentially overwhelmed and stressed and anxious. So it aligns with your values around family and around being, supportive and having their back to, learn this stuff yourself, get good at it, and be able to empower them to also develop these skills and strategies. And I get obviously tempered with not wanting to parentify that young person too much, but that was an example of, I guess, of how the moral and value stuff can be really useful. So we've talked a bit about, about vulnerability, but and this sort of to go back to Dan Romer and others, young people are driven to take risks, to grow, to experiment, and I think when done some other work around adolescent risk taking, that's it's a pretty radical reframe, but thinking about adolescent risk taking as adolescent learning. So sometimes we use a sort of analogy of adolescence being like a new tech startup. That they're pretty small. They're got a staff of 1, and a bit of bit of investment that they have to pay back pretty quickly. So got to take some risk, got to grow, got to get out there, got to get the company off the ground. So you've got to take some pretty big risks to grow and to develop and to build the company. Whereas if you're a legacy company like Kellogg Brown Root or KPMG or something, you're probably you've got trillions and squillions of money and assets and resources and buildings and whatever else. You're not going to risk that, and that's adulthood. You want to consolidate. You want to just keep what you've got and be as efficient as you can be. And I think that idea of adolescent risk taking, whether it's whatever it might be, substance use, offending, it's an attempt at learning that we need to better resource and facilitate. And again, as Dan Romer talks about, that young people still need to develop that database of experience to draw from. So we need to provide opportunities for them to take these risks and to push boundaries. And we need to think more broadly than just physical risks, because that's obviously the thing that's, the risk of physical risk can end in death. But reputational, emotional, social, relational risks are really also really important to take, and learning in those domains, so that as people move through adolescence into adulthood, they have a real wealth of experience and knowledge to draw on to make new relationships, to take new social risks. And we're talking about things like, I don't know if anyone has in your adolescence performed music, like played a gig to other young people. One of my mates are musos, and I remember that thing, you could see that like their risk taking of putting themselves out there, social, emotional, reputational risk of playing a gig in front of the school or at a freezer gig, whatever it might have been, was profound, as much as I ever got from motorbike riding and mountain bike riding and doing silly stuff physically. So thinking about resourcing those risks and giving people an opportunity to develop that database to draw from, to make better decisions, to work on, to develop that gut sense of what's good and bad and what's a good, a more or less helpful choice. There's a ton of myths I don't have time to get into about adolescent development and risk-taking, that adolescents don't understand the negative consequence of risks, but adolescents absolutely do, and they've been shown to in numerous studies. They're just much more sensitive to reward. And they're from about 15, 16 onward, their capacity for logical, rational problem solving and thinking in the same way as adults is absolutely there. But again, the preference for reward is more profound. So what do we do? How's our practice work? Developmentally appropriate practice, we're talking about all of these things, understanding adolescence, but really importantly, we want to be thinking about developmentally conducive practice as well. So we need to understand adolescents, how they work, what they need, what's important for them, but then we need to do that. So rather than just saying, we'll make sure that our office is brightly coloured because young people like more stimulating environments, and maybe we'll provide more outreach because young people don't like to be cooped up in tiny little offices, and we won't do appointments that last for an hour and a half because young people get bored up pretty quickly. But also thinking about how do we incorporate into our work with young people, our care plans, our treatment plans, opportunities for them to build the resources, to catch up, to develop the skills that they might have missed out from a variety of issues early on, whether it's issues with parenting, issues with trauma, issues with lack of opportunities. That it's our job not just to work on the issue that they present with, but to build capacity across the board so they won't be back next week with another externalisation of that sort of unmet need. So I'm going to talk a bit now about resilience-based practice, and this is like a ridiculously quick overview, considering this normally takes about 2 days to work through, but hopefully it makes enough sense. So like I mentioned before, resilience isn't just things that you have as an individual. And by that I mean, and the example that I've sometimes used is that you can be as intelligent, funny, as positive, optimistic, have the most amazing problem-solving skills, stress tolerance, emotional regulation, all of that stuff out the wazoo, and you can be the 10th kid to a single dad living in the back blocks of Hayfield with no power and water and serious mental health issues, and you're still going to be stuffed. So unless your environment and your external ecology is providing resources for resilience, you can be as internally resilient as you want and it still won't help you. It's an interaction between those two, internal and externals. So when we're talking about the needs that young people have that sometimes are met through substance use, through offending, through a variety of other things, that we need to resource. These are the risks, these are the domains of need that we talk about. And they're all pretty straightforward and obvious. You can imagine, kind of almost marry up a little bit to some Maslow's type stuff. But we're also thinking about how, given early life traumas, ACEs, negative experiences, how young people are going to have some predisposing conditions that are going to rob them or limit their resources or their capacity to meet these needs. So in that idea that we're all starting from the same start line to meet these needs in the resilience race, some young people are starting quite a few steps back with, one with their shoes untied and some with no shoes at all. So, and again, the environments they live in, whether it's out-of-home care, justice context, poverty, marginalisation, family violence, those precipitating factors that mean it's harder for them to meet these needs, and they have a higher degree of stresses on them to make this endeavour even more challenging. So these are our sort of internal resources that we want to be building, and a lot of you no doubt are doing work around these things, this work with young people and their families, and it all, I'm sure, seems pretty self-evident, these sort of things that we want to build. And one of the things in here I think that's probably sounds the most ethereal and vague, but I think it's probably almost the most meaningful and useful, is the idea of hope and optimism. So hope and optimism waxes and wanes with young people, and it can be our job in the youth AOD space and as supports broadly to hold that hope and optimism and give them a horizon or a future, a pathway that they might want to move along towards that is incongruent or at least not in alignment with their, with drug use, with offending, with criminalisation, with all of that stuff. If you only ever dream in your wildest dreams of having disability pension and Seg 1 housing, smoking 50 bongs a day and eating Xannies like they're going out of fashion fits perfectly with that. But if you wanted to be an apprentice chippy and buy a VS ute, I mean, not a great ute, but totally affordable. If you wanted to do that, and we're holding that hope and future and optimism for you, then you're going to be find that smoking 50 bongs a day doesn't fit very well with that. So there's an incongruence between that future orientation that we need to be really mindful of holding and fleshing out for young people. And again, external resources. Without these things, you're kind of stuffed. And these things have to be of quality. So these aren't just, so we've seen this with the JobKeeper, job seeker stuff, the income. So if you're on $220 a week, I don't think you can even buy cigarettes for about half a week on that much money. That's like not real money. That's not, you can't, there's been numerous reports done into the cost of rental and housing, and how if you're on Centrelink, you can probably afford a house shared with 10 other people in Warragul if you're lucky. But you're not getting anything that's anywhere near services or opportunities. obviously, I won't go into those too much details. You can have a look at those, but these are the things we need to be connecting people to, advocating for, making those linkages and connections in the spirit of the Three Peaks Tropics de-siloing endeavour that this is about, and working with young people. So things that we've seen to be useful and helpful in terms of our approach. So obviously, fundamentally, having conversations with young people about drug and alcohol issues, about their drug and alcohol use, understanding the why is really important. Like what does it do for you? What's the purpose? Where does it fit into your life? How is it helpful? What does it mean in terms of your peer relationships? You know, do you only smoke bongs with your mates? Okay, cool, that's interesting. You've got weed at home, but you never smoke it at home, only with your mates. Maybe, and we see this reasonably often, maybe smoking cannabis with your friends, sitting around in a park, sharing the bong and talking about the Illuminati and whatever other random weird ideas you've got is a really safe way to practice social connection. And we know that there's at least a reported incidence of social anxieties on the rise amongst young people. So if everyone's stoned and forgets what they were talking about 10 seconds ago, if you say something weird and wonderful that might have you, shot down and pilloried and mocked relentlessly, if you'd said it at lunchtime in year 10 at school, if you do that around a bunch of stoned mates, give it 5 seconds, they've forgotten what you just said. It's safe. It's like the training wheels for social interaction. But this is what we need to be keyed in for if we're working with young people who use drugs is what is the function? What do you get out of it? How is it useful to you? And it gives us a really clear idea of what we need to be providing or building or developing for young people. So some of the things in here as well about taking non-expert positions. So it can be really useful to, even if you do know tons about drugs and alcohol, let the young person absolutely knows more about themselves and their experience than you do. So they are the expert on their drug and alcohol use. And in getting a young person to educate you, tell you, give you information, sometimes you come across some really, really helpful things that you're really glad you found out, like the myths and furphies and complete rubbish that they hold as fact around drug and alcohol use. Like cannabis cures cancer. Had people tell me cannabis contains alien DNA. The GHB is good for bodybuilding. It's healthy. It's made out of cows. All sorts of wonderful things that if I went in from an educatory perspective and said, here's some facts you must know, young person, that would never have got across. But you find out things that, they're the sort of some of the myths and rumours and furphies, and then you know the things you need to counter. Because if you think the GHB is what bodybuilders use and it's made out of cows and it's natural and it's good for you, the likelihood of you having any sort of concern about your health and well-being for using that drug is going to be minimal. And similarly, acknowledging that young people know about their peer culture, their youth culture, how it fits into, all of that stuff in a way that, unless you're 15 living in Turnside Park and hanging out at shopping centre, you're just not going to get it. It's not your culture. Other things that are useful in here, and this might not apply to many people, but I think it's an important point, is protecting the relationship with a young person over quizzing them about their drug use or problematic behaviour. And I think when I think about that, what I think about is the relationship that we have with young people that's safe, trusting, boundaried, and consistent. And we have their best interests at heart. That if young people feel like we are there just to glean information and dob on them, tell on them, and tell them that they're too risky and they now need to go to secure welfare or whatever thing needs to happen, then they're going to be much less likely to come to that person in the future and say, hey, one of my mates said that 25I, like it's good, it's a good drug, it's good for you, it's made out of magical unicorn tears and can grant wishes. That young person, if they think you're just there as as an informant or a narc or someone who only cares about information gathering, they're not going to empower you to provide them with information to bounce ideas off. So that relationship in the medium and long term is a much more protective factor than short-term information gathering. Undermining young people who developed mastery with drug use. Sometimes, again, in terms of the resources available to young people, the only thing they're bloody good at, the only thing they put in 10,000 hours, and this is probably plenty of other things, but the thing that they put their 10,000 hours of practice into is bongs. They're bloody awesome at it. They know about sativa and indica strains. They know about, they can eyeball a kiwi from the other side of the room. They're bloody awesome at it. They can rip the biggest bongs in the eastern region, whatever. That sense of mastery is something that is important for identity and esteem and a bunch of other things. But if we come in there and tell them, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, that's incorrect, that's not true, then you're robbing them of something that's really important to them without providing something else in its place first. And this is super important with young people, youth AOD work, is that we don't want to take anything away from a young person until we've given them something better first. That's a really, really important point here. So that's, thinking about mastery, how else do we help them provide that? How do we provide opportunities for that without stripping them of the one thing they've got? And when young people quit their cannabis use, they're quitting the thing that helps them relax, it helps them connect socially, it gives them a powerful identity, helps them sleep. You've given up a lot. And unless we can provide other ways to meet those needs and other resources, we're really leaving young people high and dry, and I think it's reasonably unethical. And again, keeping in mind, or not again, but importantly, keeping in mind difference in perception with young people between short and long-term consequences and what matters to adolescents. So whilst it's important that young people know about things like liver disease when you're 50, emphysema when you're 40, all of those sort of things, absolutely important that they have that information. Young people, 14-year-olds never going to be 50. It's not a real age, it's made up. They get to like 22 and then old people are born at 30. They're a whole other species, temporally disconnected. So what we found to be quite useful is talking about things that are developmentally relevant and short-term. So I had a kid at a day program I was working at a little while ago who using a fair bit of methamphetamine, pretty problematic, causing legal issues, family issues, not going great for him. Didn't particularly care about what it meant for when he was 30, 40, 50, or his legal concerns into the future, but did want to get super buff, get his rig in order, to quote him, for Stereosonic to go and rip his shirt off, show all ladies his amazing abs, and dance to Tiesto. So that was his goal, super interested in it. And rather than hassling about how problematic his meth use was in terms of health and legal issues, one of the workers realised he was coming and using our gym memberships and eating all of our eggs and all that stuff, which we're absolutely supportive of. They one day sidled up to him and said, hey, just so you know, gently, curiously, not berating, just so you know, methamphetamine has a pretty dramatic impact on your metabolism. So if you want to get super buff, it's going to make that really hard, like it's going to really slow that down. And that young person was like, wow, man, I've got to get my rig in order though. Oh man, what am I? Oh, this is a real conundrum. And that young person ceased methamphetamine use for a number of months. I don't know what, changed jobs after that, but ceased methamphetamine use for quite a while there. Definitely ate more eggs and steaks and whatever else. And that worker not only, gave him that information that was relevant to him, that impacted his motivation for change, but also took him, like whenever he saw him, we go, let's go for a run around the block, we'll do some burpees in the park. So also providing more support and resourcing that change process. Finally, be useful. Young people don't care about your job title or how many letters you got after your name or what experience you have. They care about if you can help them, if you're of use. And if anyone, I'm sure there's plenty of you out there who've worked with young people and they're like, I don't care what your job title is, that's irrelevant to me. I like you, I trust you, you're safe and you're helpful. I'd like to get back into school and I'd like to get my license sorted. And also, can you teach me how to bake a cake? And, what's Pilates all about? That's, it's about those relationships and the people, not the sort of list of things that you can do. And the relationship is hard and important, and the skills are transferable. So if anyone, I'll share my email address, and YSAS are really keen to support any of you folks out there who might have a great relationship with a young person. They may have no interest in having another worker hassle them. But if you want to have some information or some chats about an approach to help them around drug and alcohol stuff, it's much better going through a trusting, safe, predictable, established relationship that has a solid therapeutic alliance there, than trying to start afresh just to get that information through another conduit. this is basically to sum up what I said. Relationships are more important than skills, basically. All the skills can be learnt. The relationships are the things that young people really care about. And that's back to the idea of resilience. We all have a role to play in being able to build capacity for young people so they can find other ways of meeting needs around, identity formation, safety, stability, yada, yada, and won't need to potentially rely on drug and alcohol use, dealing, offending, car thieving, whatever it might be, to meet those needs. And that's a collaborative effort. And every experience matters is the idea that in not just clinical settings, but in the line at Centrelink, when you're trying to organise their Centrelink and they're ready to crack it because they were told after 3 hours they're on the wrong line and you have to go on the other line now, that's a great opportunity to reflect with the young person on where that feeling of anger comes up from their body. Do some body mapping stuff. Do some sort of chain analysis. What was the antecedents to that stuff? Do some, in context, live practicing of some grounding techniques or distress tolerance, mindful lean, whatever it might be. But that's a great lab to do the work in much more effective and embodied and solid, meaningful way than potentially in a clinical setting or waiting for the drug and alcohol worker to have that conversation next week. So obviously COVID makes all this a lot harder, but hopefully soon that will be over. So other things to consider. Hopefully we can do a bit of a Q&A thing. I probably should just show you folks these resources if you're interested. The Youth AOD Toolbox has all the stuff we're talking about in here and more, obviously in great deal more detail. Out-of-home care toolbox focused on some of the issues that might be relevant to young people in out-of-home care and youth justice. So obviously things trauma-informed care, anger and aggression, and the young parents toolbox. So young people who might have young people themselves, some of the things that are relevant and useful around that where there's AOD involved. So that at the bottom of this screen is my email address if anyone's interested, wants more information, want to continue the conversation, but I'll unshare my screen and then we can have a conversation, I guess, or however that works. James?
Yep. I'll make sure to just to let everyone know, I'll be sending a link to the recording around to everyone who registered. I'll also include Geoff's email if Geoff's okay with that, so you can get a hold of him. And please feel free to email either me or Geoff for the slides if you'd like a copy of the slides. We do have a few questions. Catherine Alice has asked a very pertinent one. How do you think the lockdown and lack of normal external stimulation and variety might be affecting today's adolescents?
Oh my God, negatively, very negatively. Absolutely, we're seeing, I think that it's really complicated because I think for young people having that connection with peers, being able to sort of work on some of those developmental tasks, identity formation, all that, the rest of that stuff is reliant on being able to be out in the big wide world doing things with others. And I think that things like even just the regulatory process or the containment and sort of safety that young people get from having three-dimensional others around, the sort of Porges polyvagal stuff. Like if you have an attuned other who's well regulated in a three-dimensional space, that's really useful to have, and they can quite often be people like teachers, like the school wellbeing officer or other people in your world. So a lack of all of that, I think, is having a dramatic effect. But I think almost sort of a compounding factor on that is that I think that it's almost sometimes that there's not an acknowledgement that this is ridiculous. It's a freaking global pandemic. It's just the world, this is kind of crazy. And when you look outside, if you're a young person, it all looks the same. There's no bombs or smoke or tanks, but it feels very different. And there's a dissonance or a discord there, which I think is hard for young people to countenance. So I think we need to spend time just sort of talking through that stuff and giving some language to that. And I think that like the lack of opportunities for like, we're pulling our hair out at the moment, and especially in roles like mine, where essentially we work with young people who don't want to work with us, and we're selling a lifestyle. We're selling something. We're saying, hey, come buy what we've got. What we have is a better life, a more awesome life, a bigger life, a grander life, a more safe and settled life, a lifestyle. And it's just not true at the moment because there's, like, you can go and hang out with your mates and get COVID fines and smoke bongs, or nothing really else on. It's all shut. So that makes it really, really difficult for young people, I think. Cheers. Joe, Ms. Driscoll, is how we conceptualise young person's problems and how we talk about the problems impactful on their identity development? Is this a way of countering the antisocial identity development, such as example of the mad dog you gave? Look, I think language is profoundly important, and the way that we frame things for young people has a big impact. But I think that that needs to be paired with an experience, with an actual opportunity to be in environments and spaces and places and have experiences of not being that person, of not being, that if the only experiences you have are, Ringwood Court, your out-of-home care resi setting and Parkville, then, no matter how you reframe that, that sort of powerful identity, or how you reframe their behaviour, they're having an embodied experience and a learning that's profound around that around that negativity. So this is, like I said, absolutely profoundly biased in this, but the adventure-based therapy stuff I did kind of after starting in AOD, youth AOD, so I saw it as being a really great way to provide a profound and sort of heavy-duty experience for young people to really genuinely see themselves in a different light, to have not just that language change and that reframe, but to have a genuine sort of witnessing of them being different, of them being, supportive, caring, leading, helping, whatever that stuff, being profoundly skilled and excellent and amazing and all of that stuff. And I think that when that language change is paired with a really well-designed and curated experience, again, adventure-based therapy is a big fan, then I think it has a profound resonance. Your thoughts on the AOD outcome star? I found it can be useful as a tool to help young people identify priority areas and open up discussions in relation to goal setting and values. On the downside, it isn't specific and some of the domains are not necessarily relevant. So my experience with the outcome star is that it's been a while since I've kind of looked at it, but it can be useful for young people to look at things that they want to work at, to figure out where they are, how they're progressing, to have a sense of feedback around that progress, around where they're moving, and to give them a bit of a handle on things, because I think it can potentially, for young people, feel a bit like Groundhog Day, just like, they might have made massive changes and you ask them about it, like, I don't know, have I? What's even happened? So it can be really useful in that way. And there's another tool that we looked at a while ago from the ACRA Adolescent Community Reinforcement Approach Manual that looks at what's called, but basically it's a similar kind of idea with different domains that young people might choose to work on or think they want to progress. And it's sort of used as an all roads lead to Rome thing. So where do you think there is progress to be made? What are you motivated to work on? Great, awesome, let's do that thing. Employment, family connections, whatever. That's where they want to start. That's what they're motivated to do. And when you start on that journey, you'll find that if you want to improve family connections, pinching stuff and selling it for weed, and having all your dodgy mates over all the time who are buying weed off you might be a bit of a problem in terms of your family. So the thing you want to work on comes into opposition with potentially your drug using lifestyle. So then the motivation can transfer to working on some of those other issues. But I think the thing about those outcome stars and those type of tools is that I think they have absolute utility and merit. But I think that's and we talk about at YSAS a bit is the idea of the eye on the path and idea on the present. So that's what the young person works on. Great, awesome, wonderful. But we are also thinking about how do we set them up in a month's time, 6 months' time, a year's time, 5 years' time, to have all of those other resources, assets, capacities and connections that they won't, that they might not identify, like, I would like to do some schema work, please, Geoff, that would be wonderful for me. Or I'd like to develop a greater connection with health services to set me up into my 30s. But there might be things that we sort of think this needs, their beliefs around health services, their beliefs around help seeking, that's kind of our little sub-agenda. Like, so we might be doing their stuff, their goal setting, but also have that secondary kind of thing that we know is going to be useful for them moving forwards. Katrina, do you think we have adequate social resources across the community for a diverse population of adolescents? If not, how can we improve? Have you seen improvements? So I guess look, I don't think we have adequate social resources, and I think the challenge is that I think it's regularly these things are thought out and planned and delivered and developed by non-adolescents, by adult brains. And one thing that really stands out for me recently is, if anyone's come across this, kids building BMX jumps, dirt jumps in parks, this kind of thing. There's been quite a few that have been, there's either this thing of we need to build more jump parks for kids to do dirt jumping, playing stuff, or more skate parks or whatever, because these dirt jump things that they're getting together and building are janky and dangerous and whatever. But it really profoundly misses the point, is that it's not more skate parks or dirt jump things that kids want, is they want to find a space and a place away from adults where they can get their mates and their shovels and they can argue and bicker about how to build it, and they can keep progressing and trying to have this shared collective endeavour, that they can have a sense of mastery and achievement and community and connection, all of these things that the jumps are almost, whether or not they're any good or safe or fun to ride, is almost secondary to that process of a collaborative, shared peer endeavour, very much separate to what the parent, it's never in your parents' backyard. It's down a local park behind the trees where people can't see. Like to me, I feel like that's the sort of spirit with which youth projects or youth resources, social resources, freezer gigs, whatever it might be, I think are a good example. Things that speak to the needs of adolescents, not just sort of like, oh, they need to take risks. Great, awesome, here's a skate park. But they, young people want to build things. They want, think about tree houses. Who didn't build tree houses and cubby houses? That's, it wasn't about someone buying you a store-bought one. It's about the janky, dodgy process of building and creating. Do you think being parents as role models can help children stay away from drugs as well? Look, I think yes and no. I think very much there's a whole other thing about patterns of drug use stuff that is worth thinking about. But experimentation, trying new things, novel, dangerous, risky things is absolutely the wheelhouse of adolescence. So more than, modelling, being role models, showing not just that you don't use drugs, but that you have really adaptive and meaningful ways of coping, that you try things that might be difficult, like yoga, meditation, whatever it might be, that you are willing to help seek, that you're willing to talk about things that are problematic for you, that you are, that you are being and doing the things that we like to young people do, because they don't just sort of trip over and they got a bong in their hand. There's they might experiment and have a dabble here and there, but when it sort of sticks, it's usually because it's meeting those needs. So I think if you can model meeting needs in a meaningful way, meeting needs in a sustainable and safe way, and meeting needs in a proactive way, and that's something that's discussed and is modelled regularly, I think that's going to be the bigger deterrent for young people, rather than just seeing a sort of singular behaviour of not using substances, if that makes sense. What would your best piece of advice be for connecting with a young person in one of your programs? So I'm wondering if this is a question about potentially how to build a rapport, or whether that's about whether that young person's an AOD client already, or a YSAS client, and maybe getting them to link into another service. So I might answer the second one first, because it's probably the easier one to answer. That one of the things that can be really useful, say if I've got a young person I'm working with as an AOD worker, and I have that rapport and therapeutic alliance, is that rather than saying, hey, give Stacey a call, give Elliot a call, he's great or she's great, whatever, that they'll help you with X, Y, and Z. But going along with talking about that person, meeting up together, spending time, so you kind of let them potentially marinate in that trust and therapy alliance that you have with that young person. So, rather than that kind of handball thing, that we'll all hang out, play together, and that you'll show that they're useful and you're vouching for them, basically saying like an eBay trusted seller, like dealt with them before, they're actually good, they're solid. So, and also finding out what their anxieties are about it. Like, is it that they feel like if they see a mental health professional, then they'll all of a sudden be medicated or pathologized? Is it about, if I see a housing worker, then they're going to put me in public housing, and that's where my dad lived and I hated it? Sometimes there's some blocks in that stuff. I guess the general thing about connecting with young people, I think, is as much as possible just being genuine. Like, I have the amazing luck of being profoundly gangster. So that's a really great thing I've got going for me. But as a white middle class kid from the suburbs, but I think if you if you can be yourself as much as possible, and be interested, being the young people, youth culture, their specific subculture is profoundly interesting and really relevant to how we might support young people. So having genuine interest in that stuff, being non-judgmental, that basic stuff. But I've had people in the past have conversations with me about how do you learn all of the drug lingo for young people? How do you, what do they call this and how do they do that stuff? That might be true of kids last week in Croydon, but it's not going to be true next week. It changes dramatically. So unless you can have a sort of a genuine sort of curiosity and interest and compassion towards that their culture and their lifestyle and their peer connections are useful, meaningful, and provide a purpose to them. Because I think there's a lot of adults, when they speak to young people about their youth culture and their even offending culture, all that stuff is like, well, you shouldn't be. Well, I'm interested. Tell me more about how you steal the cars, but don't steal the cars. I think if you can park that and just try and understand them, some people are really interested in being understood in my experience. Hopefully that answers. The emphasis on, so the emphasis needs to be on professional and boundaried relationships with young people. Too often workers have had very blurred boundaries, trying to be their mate rather than a therapeutic relationship. 100% agree, and I think this is a conversation we have very regularly about sharing experience, lived experience, all of that sort of stuff kind of comes into the mix here, and that the idea of you are friendly, you're not their friend, and that 9 to 5, that having those boundaries of being really clear with young people on what to expect, because unfortunately we are all in temporary roles, we're not adopting these kids, so we will leave them unless we can be really clear about what our role is and what the boundaries and conditions of this relationship is. Young people are really liable to think it's something more than what it is and be really damaged by that, and it can really reinforce some of those schemas about their self-worth, some of those attachment challenges they have. So I absolutely completely agree with that stuff, and I think that like I say, I think you can be curious and compassionate to what's going on for them, and I think you can have fun, you can have a laugh, you can take the piss, you can be reasonably laid back, but still be professional and boundaried. And I think it's also about when you have those conversations with young people about privacy, confidentiality, the domains and constraints of the relationship you have with them. Really important to revisit that and check in about that. Because I've had young people smiling, yep, I totally know what you're saying, absolutely. And then you're like, so, can you, what does that mean to you? They're like, it's what you said, the thing, I don't know, yeah, whatever. But, there's a lot of assumptions in the language we have, especially if you work with adults. There's a lot of everyone knows this stuff, everyone knows that stuff. Especially if you talk to professionals a lot, we talk to each other and we're like, that framework and this framework and that approach. And, young people are like, yep, of course, whatever. Yep, I don't know what you said, fine, I'll take the thing. So really checking in about what that means. If a young person calls you on the weekend, just saying, hey, were you just really baked and forgot it was the weekend? Or do you think I work on the weekends? Just so we want to be clear here, that's an opportunity for us to check in about this relationship. I'm wondering if maybe I haven't explained it well, but I think that's a really important point. And I think the youth sector has been plagued by some of those issues in the past, absolutely. So why is a relationship more important to a young person than having skills? That's about that point I made about protect the relationship over drug and alcohol information stuff. A relationship, they're neither is more important than the other. It's really about needing all of those things. If it's maybe about that point I made about protecting the relationship over doing the quiz, really sometimes what happens in various parts of the sector is people are pushed from an anxious system, whether it's justice, child protection or other, that we need to know what the young person's doing, what are they doing, how much are they using, when are they using it, what's happening with that stuff. And that need for information is a way of managing anxiety and feeling more in control. It doesn't necessarily change anything in their safety, but if that young person feels like the person who's prying for that information, who's just there to kind of do the inquisition, then that person they're going to be less likely to turn to that person when they want advice, information, want to check in about stuff. That's kind of the point I was making, is that it's great to get that information if we can, but if you have a choice of burning a therapeutic relationship, an alliance and a trust over doing a quiz about how much cannabis they smoked in a week, I'd choose the relationship every time. But I think the relationship we have with the young person is pretty essential in terms of building skills, because it's not the kind of thing you can really do on a homework sheet usually. You need to have a chance to go back and forth and to be able to know and see and attune to that young person when you're trying to get them to not jump the counter at Centrelink and punch someone because their payment's late or whatever that thing has been, that you need to have that therapeutic alliance and that trust and that capacity to challenge. That if you've got a solid, safe relationship, you can call things out that you might see that if you don't have that, is not going to land at all well or safely. So skills is 100% really important for developing with a young person. And I think maybe it's also the other point I made about that the relationship is more important than the specific skill set. And by that, I mean, if I'm working in a shared care environment with a young person who has had terrible experiences with mental health and terrible experience with youth justice and terrible experience with AOD, but they have this living care worker who they just love and who's awesome and they get along really well with. I can just support the living care worker to do some harm reduction stuff. I can support them to do a relapse prevention plan. I can consult and do secondary, like what I meant is that the skills are more transportable. That if they are like, I despise tall people with crappy goatees and I will never work with you. I mean, I'm 6'7", but I can't, shave the goatee. I'm kind of stuck with that. I'm going to struggle to have that relationship to do that work. But James might have an awesome relationship with them, and I can support James to do that stuff, because the skills we have in our roles have all been learnt. There's nothing magical about them. We haven't been sort of gifted them in a radioactive accident. So I think that's what I was sort of getting at around that point, that it's not about more important. It's just that the skills are more transferable. And there's sometimes, again, it might just be like we've had a conversation with the other principal prac at YSAS, Peter, and we're talking about how sometimes just your face, just who you are, who you represent, who you remind them of in their life, you can't work against that stuff. Like that there's some young people that he just gets great traction with that I can't. It's just because of my face, and just because of who I am, because of my age, because of my size, shape, those sort of things. And again, that's like, unless I get sort of dramatic, profound surgeries or whatever, it's just much easier to shift the skills. So hopefully that answers that question. How can we encourage, sorry, James, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm on mute. I was just going to say, this will be the last question and is the last question listed on the thing. So we'll finish up after this one.
Cool. So how can we encourage all people working with young people to have the same goals and work together when there are so many people working with one young person and some people appear not to care as much? That's a magic, hopefully. It's a really difficult question. I think there's some stuff in that resilience-based framework that we're talking about a little earlier, that there's some care planning, collaborative care planning stuff that we've talked about with different services about how everyone from all of the different areas, regardless of whether someone wants to see no drug use, someone wants to see a reduction in drug use, and the young person wants to stay the same, that we can all understand that in building these resources and capacities and skills that we're going to have a positive impact for the young person. That it kind of gives us a way of potentially aligning disparate interests and motivations around the health, well-being, future orientation, and positive outcomes for the young person. So, and I think that way it's not like you fix their drug and alcohol work, and then you fix their housing, and then you fix their justice stuff, and then that, and once that's all done, because that that doesn't work. So, if that anonymous attendee, please give us an email, and I can tell you a bit more about that sort of collaborative care planning stuff that we seem to be getting reasonable traction with.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, thanks everyone. Thanks for attending, and a very special thanks to Geoff, who's just given an incredible presentation today, full of information and a lot to think about. Thanks everyone. Again, I'll be emailing everyone who registered with a link to the recording, and if you do want a copy of the slides, you can email me, and I'll make sure everyone has access to Geoff's email as well, so you can get in touch with him.
And thank you for your awesome questions and coming along, and please be in touch if you need anything.
No worries. Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.